In the sweltering jungles of Vietnam, where the air hung thick like soup and even a breath could give away your position, survival often came down to one thing: not being seen, not being heard, and not being smelled. So why did the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, elite among the elite, stop shaving, stop showering, and start smelling like the jungle itself? It wasn't laziness, it wasn't poor discipline. In fact, it was the exact opposite. It was calculated, purposeful, deadly. While many American soldiers arrived in Vietnam with hygiene kits full of deodorants, aftershave, scented soap, and foot powder, the Australians, particularly their SAS patrols, were throwing those same items out. Not just out of their packs, but out of their doctrine altogether. To the untrained eye, this seemed insane. Why would hardened soldiers willingly embrace the stench of sweat, dirt, and rot in a jungle teeming with insects, disease, and 90% humidity? Because as the war unfolded, it became terrifyingly clear. The Viet Cong and NVA could smell the Americans coming. Not figuratively, literally. Vietnamese guerrillas who had lived in the jungle their whole lives developed an uncanny ability to detect unfamiliar scents: foreign toothpaste, laundry detergent, cigarette smoke, mosquito repellent, even the faint sweetness of canned rations or chewing gum. In the absence of clear trails or sound, they relied on scent like hunters in the dark. To them, a freshly washed foreigner didn't smell clean. He smelled wrong. He smelled like target. And the consequences were lethal. There were patrols that never came back. Ambushes triggered by nothing more than the drifting trace of soap carried on the wind. Soldiers who were careful with sound, careful with light, but forgot about smell. And in the jungle, that was fatal. Australian SAS teams learned this early. They watched American units move through the forest in tight columns, clean, polished, deodorized, and get lit up. They saw NVA troops sniff the air like wolves and melt into ambush positions before a single leaf had rustled. The Australians began to realize what few others did. The jungle was alive, and it could betray you if you didn't learn how to disappear inside it. So the SAS made a radical decision. They stopped washing. They let their sweat and skin oils build. They let their uniforms absorb the smell of mud, leaves, and fire. They blended not just visually, but chemically into the environment. Their scent became jungle, their presence undetectable. And to them, it wasn't disgusting. It was smart. It was tactical. It was the difference between being a ghost in the green or a corpse on the trail. This was the philosophy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. Everything that makes you clean makes you detectable. And everything that makes you uncomfortable, stinking, sweaty, filthy, might just keep you alive. Because in a place where the enemy hunted you by smell, smelling like death was better than smelling like soap. To understand why Australian SAS stopped shaving and showering in Vietnam, you have to understand where they were fighting. The jungle wasn't just thick, it was alive. Every leaf dripped moisture. Every footstep sank into damp, black mud. The air didn't move. Sounds didn't travel far, but smells did. This wasn't a battlefield of open fields and sweeping maneuvers. It was a world where a man could disappear 5 feet away. Vision was often useless. Hearing was distorted by rain, insects, and thick undergrowth. But scent traveled. And in this suffocating maze of bamboo, rotting vines, and rain-soaked foliage, even the faintest trace of soap could float for hundreds of meters. To survive here, you had to vanish completely. Not just from sight and sound, but from scent. And for the men of the Australian SAS, that meant embracing something most soldiers are trained to avoid: becoming feral. Unlike conventional infantry units, SAS patrols operated in extreme isolation. 4 to 6 men would be inserted deep into enemy-controlled jungle, often for weeks at a time. Their missions were brutal in scope and simplicity: observe, stalk, ambush, survive. There were no front lines, no backup, and no margin for error. The jungle was their battlefield, and also their cloak. Every movement was calculated. Every breath, every footfall, every rustle of gear could mean death. And over time, they began to realize it wasn't just what you did that could give you away, it was what you smelled like. American soldiers, by contrast, came from a different environment and a different warfighting doctrine. Most were rotated into Vietnam without jungle warfare experience. They brought with them the comforts of home, hygiene routines, scented toiletries, clean uniforms, canned rations. They didn't realize those same comforts could betray them. There are dozens of accounts from SAS operators, and even American recon units, who tell the same story. You could smell some U.S. units before you ever saw them. One SAS veteran recalled detecting an American patrol moving 100 meters away, not by noise, not by movement, but by the faint smell of shaving cream drifting through the vines. Worse still, the enemy could smell them too. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army weren't just fighters, they were hunters. Many had grown up in those jungles. They knew the smells of the forest, the rotting leaves, the animal dung, the human sweat of a local farmer, and they could tell when something foreign entered their world. Scent was their early warning system. To them, the chemically sterile, deodorized, minty fresh scent of American troops wasn't clean. It was alien. It was dangerous. It screamed, "Here comes the enemy." And so the SAS adapted. They stopped using soap. They let their beards grow. They wore the same uniform for weeks. When water was available, they rinsed, but never scrubbed. No scented products, no cologne, no aftershave. Their goal was not just to stay quiet, but to smell like they belonged in the jungle. One senior patrol commander even ordered new team members to ditch all hygiene products before a mission. "If I smell you," he said flatly, "they'll smell you first." This wasn't about being unclean. It was about becoming invisible to all five senses. The jungle didn't care if you were dirty. It cared if you were alive. And if your scent gave you away, you wouldn't be alive for long. For the Australian SAS, the lesson was clear. You don't win in the jungle by being clean. You win by disappearing. And that started with smelling like everything else the jungle forgot to kill. For the Australian SAS, disappearing wasn't just a tactic. It was a mentality, a mindset, a philosophy of war honed long before Vietnam. They didn't enter the jungle to fight like conventional soldiers. They entered to become part of the terrain itself, to melt into the shadows between the leaves, to erase every sign that a human being had ever passed through. And to truly disappear, they embraced an idea most soldiers never consider. If the enemy can smell you, you don't exist as a soldier. You exist as prey. From their first steps into Vietnam, SAS patrols understood they were walking into an environment that punished even the smallest mistake. A shiny object reflecting a sunbeam could give away your position. A snapped twig underfoot could betray an entire patrol. The cling of metal gear, the rustle of a nylon pack, even the sound of breath drawn too sharply, all carried farther than expected in the still humid air. But above all these, one sense stood out: smell. The Viet Cong didn't rely on scent because they were primitive or lacking technology. They used scent because it worked. And so the SAS adapted by asking a simple, brutal question. What does a human smell like when he belongs to the jungle? And what does he smell like when he doesn't? Once they framed the problem this way, everything changed. It wasn't enough to hide visually behind face paint. It wasn't enough to stay silent or move slowly. They needed to match the jungle's chemical signature. Its damp earth, decaying leaves, mildew, sweat, smoke, and rot. This was the heart of SAS philosophy. Becoming invisible meant becoming indistinguishable. To the SAS, scent discipline became as critical as fire discipline. It became another form of weapon safety, a rule that could not be violated. Patrol commanders enforced it without compromise. A bar of soap was as dangerous as a flashlight. A spritz of deodorant was as reckless as firing a rifle by accident. Scent was treated as a physical footprint, a glowing trail the enemy could follow with a predator's instinct. And the Australians knew they couldn't win a scent-based war by being clean. Clean was a weakness. Clean was predictable. Clean was American. This wasn't an insult. It was an observation grounded in battlefield reality. The U.S. Army, arriving with the world's most advanced logistics system, had hygiene standards built for barracks, bases, and open field operations. They rotated in fresh uniforms. They shaved regularly. They cleaned gear with disinfectants. They used insect repellent by the handful. In a conventional war, these habits made sense. But in Vietnam, the Australians saw a different truth. Every foreign smell was a signal flare, a scented death sentence. And so a different pattern emerged among the SAS. They wore their sweat like armor. They accepted grime as camouflage. They embraced discomfort as a tactical necessity. One veteran put it bluntly, "We weren't trying to look like ghosts. We were trying to smell like them." By ghost, he didn't mean spirits. He meant the almost mythical Viet Cong, fighters who slipped through the bush without leaving so much as a footprint. For SAS patrols, matching that level of invisibility required a deliberate shift in identity. They weren't soldiers marching through a foreign land. They were shadows, animals, shapes without scent or sound. They relied not on technology but on instinct, their own and the enemy's. This was the SAS philosophy of disappearance. To survive the jungle, you didn't dominate it. You submitted to it. You became part of it. And the moment you embraced that truth, the jungle stopped trying to kill you and started hiding you. To understand why scent mattered so much in Vietnam, you first have to understand the hunters who lived there. The Viet Cong didn't need night vision goggles, motion sensors, or drones. They had something far older, far more primal, and far more terrifyingly effective: the ability to smell the foreigner before they ever saw him. To Western soldiers, the idea sounded absurd, almost animalistic. But to the Vietnamese guerrilla, scent was simply another tool, as natural as listening for footsteps or scanning the tree line. They grew up in the jungle. They lived in it, slept in it, cooked in it, bled in it. To them, the rainforest had a smell, one unified signature, a complex swirling blend of rotting leaves, wet soil, bamboo sap, wood smoke, sweat, and mildew. Anything that didn't match that signature stood out like a flare in the night. And nothing stood out more than the smell of foreigners. There are countless verified accounts of Viet Cong trackers identifying the presence of American units long before visual contact, not by noise, not by footprints, but by scent drifting between the trees. Some were so skilled they could determine how far away the enemy was, how many men were in the patrol, and even what direction they were moving, all from the faint trace their bodies and gear released into the stagnant air. One NVA scout described American troops this way: "You could smell them long before you saw them. They smelled like chemicals, soap, and foreign food." To him, that wasn't an insult. It was a battlefield observation, a tactical reality. The smells that gave away U.S. patrols were small, even innocent: shaving cream, laundry detergent, deodorant, toothpaste, mosquito repellent, cigarettes, foot powder, canned rations, even chewing gum. All harmless items in civilian life. But in Vietnam's jungle, they became signatures of death. The Vietnamese didn't merely detect them, they interpreted them. Mosquito repellent meant a large American unit had passed recently. Mint toothpaste meant there were officers present. Cigarette smoke meant complacency. Gun oil, a uniquely American scent, meant weapons had just been cleaned. Aftershave meant soldiers fresh from base were on patrol. To a skilled tracker, these weren't just smells. They were intelligence reports carried on the wind. And the Australians saw this firsthand. SAS patrols sometimes discovered fresh NVA movement on trails they hadn't touched, only to realize the enemy had been moving toward the smell of an American position, not theirs. Vietnamese scouts often bypassed Australian units entirely, sometimes passing within meters of them without reacting. To the SAS, this was proof. The VC weren't superhuman. They were using tools the Australians had simply learned to respect. One SAS patrol commander recounted an incident where they found an abandoned VC observation post with notes scribbled in charcoal. Among them was a chilling line: "American soldiers nearby. Smelled them this morning." There were no footprints, no broken branches, no visible sign of movement, just scent. This was when the Australians truly understood that scent wasn't an accidental danger. It was a deliberate battlefield factor. The VC weren't just passively sniffing the air, they were actively hunting through it. For the Viet Cong, scent was an early warning radar. For the Australians, it became a survival lesson. But for many American units, it became a deadly blind spot. And once the SAS realized how deeply their enemy relied on smell, they knew they had only one option: remove their own scent entirely or become the hunted. Once the Australian SAS understood how heavily the Viet Cong relied on scent to hunt, they began taking scent discipline as seriously as fire discipline. To them, it wasn't enough to avoid detection. They had to eliminate their chemical footprint, to become as neutral to the jungle as a fallen leaf. And that required one thing above all, erasing the smell of being human. The process was slow, brutal, and deeply uncomfortable, but it worked. Before patrol, SAS teams would systematically strip away every source of foreign scent. The ritual began days before insertion. New recruits were ordered to discard everything with a fragrance: soap, shampoo, foot powder, deodorant, toothpaste, even mosquito repellent. These weren't suggestions, well, they were non-negotiable orders. If it smelled like civilization, it didn't go into the jungle. Shaving kits were tossed. Razor blades were left behind. Uniforms were pre-aged, either soaked in muddy water or worn for days straight before a mission. Fresh-pressed clothing, smelling faintly of detergent or starch, was a liability. Clean boots were quickly muddied. Metal buckles were taped. Weapon oil was wiped down and replaced with minimal, odorless lubrication. Some SAS operators went further, rubbing crushed leaves, charcoal, or jungle mud into their uniforms to dull both scent and shine. In certain cases, teams carried dried dirt from the AO, area of operations, and dusted themselves down before a mission began. One patrol sergeant referred to this as chemical camouflage. To the uninitiated, it looked like superstition. To those who survived patrol after patrol, deep in enemy territory, it was pure practicality. Water, of course, was precious, but even when rivers or streams were available, bathing wasn't what you'd expect. No soap, no scrubbing, just a rinse, enough to cool off or remove blood and mud, but never enough to strip away the natural oils and scent profile the body had developed over days in the bush. Because ironically, the longer a man stayed in the jungle, sweating, eating, sleeping in it, the less he smelled like a foreigner. His scent began to harmonize with the environment. The bacteria on his skin changed. His uniform began to reek not of plastic packaging or laundry powder, but of mildew, wood smoke, and wet foliage. In time, the jungle accepted him, and so did the enemy's nose. A senior SAS patrol leader once said, "After 5 days without soap, you don't smell like a man anymore. You smell like dirt and rain." And that's the whole point. The result? Patrols became chemically invisible. Viet Cong scouts passed within meters of concealed Australians and never stopped. Trained dogs lost the trail. Scent-triggered ambushes were avoided entirely. American recon teams who occasionally accompanied SAS units were stunned by how close the Australians could get without being detected, and how different they smelled by day 4 in the field. Even weapons were treated with scent in mind. Some SAS modified wooden rifle stocks to remove varnish that emitted a faint chemical smell in the heat. Others chose to carry less gear altogether, reducing friction and scent trace as they moved. If it wasn't essential to the mission, it didn't come. If it had a smell, it was neutralized. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but it was deadly effective. In Vietnam, smell was a sixth sense, a whisper, a shadow. And while most armies tried to hide from sight, the SAS went deeper, erasing their scent until the jungle could no longer tell man from mud. They didn't just camouflage their bodies. They vanished from the chemical memory of the land itself. The jungle didn't care how clean you were, but the Viet Cong did. To them, a man who smelled like soap, mint, or chemicals might as well have been waving a white flag with the word target printed on it. In Vietnam, good hygiene wasn't just unnecessary, it was dangerous. And for some unlucky soldiers, it was fatal. Throughout the war, there were quiet, chilling incidents. Moments when patrols vanished without warning, ambushes were triggered too early, or booby traps seemed placed with uncanny precision. In many of these cases, the common factor wasn't poor tactics or loud movement. It was scent. One infamous story comes from a U.S. long-range reconnaissance patrol that disappeared in Phuoc Toi province in early 1968. The team had been inserted for a 5-day recon mission. Their comms went silent after day 2. When recovery teams arrived, they found no bodies, just traces of a fight, blood in the mud, and a half-used bottle of Old Spice deodorant in a pack torn open by shrapnel. It was a grim joke among Australian SAS afterward. Smelled like a department store. Probably died like one too. But it wasn't just about toiletries. The enemy had learned to recognize the patterns of cleanliness and weaponize them. Viet Cong units began laying traps not just on trails but downwind of likely patrol routes. They used the breeze like a sensor, waiting for a whiff of detergent, cologne, or canned rations. If they smelled something unnatural, they'd set up an ambush. If the scent grew stronger, they'd tighten the noose. In some cases, the VC would plant scent traps of their own, leaving foreign-smelling items like soap bars or cigarette butts in random spots, then watching to see if curious patrols took the bait. American soldiers, trained to police the area for signs of enemy movement, would investigate and walk right into a kill zone. It got to the point where Australian SAS patrols would actively avoid any place that smelled like humans, even if it was friendly scent, because in Vietnam, even the smell of your own side could get you killed. One SAS operator recalled a close call. "We were tracking a VC resupply trail and got a whiff of tobacco. Sweet, like cherry pipe smoke. Americans. Probably recon. But it was fresh, so we peeled off and waited. 10 minutes later, they walked straight into an L-shaped ambush. None of them made it out. The implication was clear. The VC were hunting more than targets. They were listening with their noses, waiting for the unnatural to drift past. And the Australians? They adapted by becoming unnatural in a different way. They smelled like rot, mud, and ash. They smoked hand-rolled tobacco, or didn't smoke at all. They ate local food when possible, boiled rice in bamboo tubes, avoided canned rations unless necessary. They packed light, stayed low, and accepted discomfort as the cost of invisibility. Meanwhile, many U.S. troops were still rotating through with peacetime habits, shaving daily, cleaning gear with scented oil, and stuffing hygiene kits into their rucks. They didn't realize that their enemy was tracking their scent before they ever saw their boots. In the harsh arithmetic of jungle warfare, comfort could be fatal. A moment of self-care could ripple out like an echo, drawing attention, focusing enemy senses, and leading to death. Quiet, sudden, and unseen. That's why, in the eyes of the Australian SAS, dirt wasn't the enemy. Cleanliness was. Because in Vietnam, smelling human wasn't a right. It was a mistake, one the jungle would never forgive. At first, the Australians were alone in their approach, filthy, unshaven, and reeking of damp soil. To American troops, especially fresh arrivals, the SAS looked more like outlaws than elite soldiers. Their uniforms were faded and stained, their boots caked in mud, their beards grew wild, and their scent, if you could even find it, was more jungle than man. But in time, the Americans started to notice something else about these strange, dirty men. They came back. And more importantly, they came back unseen. The shift didn't happen overnight, but it began quietly in the field, where theory dies and results speak loudest. American recon units, particularly SEAL teams, LRRPs, long-range reconnaissance patrols, and MACV-SOG operators started to cross paths with Australian SAS patrols on joint operations. What they saw left an impression. The Australians didn't move like conventional troops. They flowed. They traveled lighter. They spoke less. They vanished when they wanted to. And most strangely, they didn't smell like soldiers. No soap, no gun oil, no foot powder or minty toothpaste. They had the heavy scent of the forest. Bark, smoke, old sweat, and dirt. At first, American operators mocked them. Then they studied them. Then they copied them. An early turning point came during a joint ambush patrol in 1969 in the Mekong Delta. A mixed team of SEALs and SAS was lying in wait on a jungle trail when one SEAL lit a cigarette. Just a single drag to keep his nerves steady. The SAS point man crushed it instantly. "No smoke," he growled. "They smell everything." The American, annoyed, shrugged. But 10 minutes later, a VC scout passed within 15 feet of their position and froze. He sniffed the air, unsure, but there was no cigarette now, no soap, just jungle. He moved on. The SEAL never smoked on patrol again. Word began to spread. SEAL teams, eager to improve their survivability, started ditching hygiene products on long missions. LRRPs removed scent-heavy gear. MACV-SOG teams learned to wrap gear in vegetation, let their uniforms age, and let their own bodies marinate in sweat and soil. Some even adopted the SAS habit of using mud or charcoal to dull their natural scent. One LRRP veteran later joked, "We stopped smelling like men. We started smelling like ghosts." And it turns out that's exactly what you want to be in the jungle. Even the Navy took notice. Field manuals were quietly updated. Advisors briefed new special forces teams on scent discipline. The idea that smell could kill, once dismissed as folklore, was now doctrine. It wasn't just about avoiding soap. It was about adapting to a deeper truth. In Vietnam, the jungle was a living organism, and it rejected anything foreign. To survive, you had to become part of the ecology, not just dress the part, not just move silently, but smell like you belonged. This cross-pollination of tactics, Australian stealth married with American aggression, created some of the deadliest, most effective units in the entire war. Joint patrols started succeeding at higher rates. Contact was minimized, casualties dropped, and respect, hard-earned and never given lightly, grew on both sides. SEALs once joked that the Australians smelled like wet possums, but by 1970, many were packing like them, walking like them, and yes, smelling like them. Because by then, the lesson had sunk in. You could carry the best gear in the world. You could have the sharpest aim, the fastest reflexes, the best intel. But if the enemy smelled you first, none of that would matter. By the time the Australian SAS rotated out of Vietnam in the early 1970s, they left behind more than just battlefield victories and kill ratios. They left behind a philosophy of disappearance, a doctrine forged in silence, sweat, and soil, one that changed how special operations would be conducted for decades to come. And at the heart of that philosophy wasn't just marksmanship or tactics, it was scent. It seems almost absurd when viewed through the lens of modern warfare, where satellites, drones, and infrared imaging dominate the battlefield. But in the thick, breathing chaos of Vietnam's triple canopy jungle, where the nearest support was days away and death moved on sandals, the ability to not smell human became a critical skill, as vital as map reading, as fundamental as radio protocol. And nowhere was that better understood than in the Australian SAS. They didn't just teach soldiers how to shoot or hide. They taught them how to vanish from the enemy's senses entirely. Sight, sound, and smell. It was a kind of full-spectrum invisibility, achieved not through high-tech gadgets, but through patience, discipline, and raw fieldcraft. That ethos rippled outward. American SEALs, LRRPs, and SOG teams brought those lessons home. They influenced training programs, mission preparation, and even how modern forces approach long-duration reconnaissance in hostile environments. Scent discipline, once a bushman's superstition, became institutional wisdom in certain circles. But beyond tactics, there was something deeper, a mindset shift. The Australian SAS taught Allied forces that survival wasn't about dominating the jungle. It was about blending with it, not overpowering nature, but submitting to it, not conquering the battlefield, but ceasing to exist upon it. That meant accepting discomfort. It meant letting go of ego, of identity, of the neat lines of uniformity. It meant throwing out your razor, smelling like mold, and sweating into the same uniform for 12 days straight, because the alternative, the scent of clean, might get you killed. One SAS veteran would later reflect, "The jungle didn't reward strength. It rewarded those who could dissolve." This dissolution wasn't just physical, it was psychological. SAS troopers trained to erase themselves, to remove every signal, every presence, until the jungle no longer noticed them, and neither did the enemy. It's why VC units would later write in captured reports, "Australians move like ghosts, smell like the earth, hard to find, hard to kill." That legacy lives on in special operations units around the world. Today, scent suppression plays a role in high-stakes operations, from long-range sniper missions to jungle survival schools. The understanding that human smell is a signature, a vulnerability, has informed camouflage development, gear design, and pre-mission hygiene protocols. Modern soldiers might carry carbon-lined uniforms, scent-blocking sprays, or odor-neutral kits, high-tech tools rooted in the low-tech genius of soldiers who once stopped showering to survive. But while the tools have evolved, the core idea hasn't changed. Disappearance is not an accident, it is a discipline. And in many ways, no one mastered that discipline like the Australian SS in Vietnam. They didn't need to be seen. They didn't want to be heard. And if they did their job right, they were never even smelled. Because in a war where the jungle could betray you at any moment, the greatest compliment the enemy could give was never knowing you were there at all.